site, cavespringschurchofchrist.org. You can go to our Facebook page, and you can see the lessons from this class that we have done up to this point. And as we're tackling the book of Revelation, and as there are so many different ideas about the things within the book of Revelation, we are just trying to approach this from a standpoint that we do everything else. Let's just let the Bible define itself. Let's let the Bible tell us what it means. And so that's been our approach. And so, but I would recommend that you go back and look. Everything as we study through builds on what comes next. And so to see kind of where we started in the beginning of the book of Revelation, as we saw, the first 11 chapters, really from chapter 4 through 11, as we look at the book of Revelation, we're looking at it in this kind of like a drama. He's painting a picture and telling a story through the book of Revelation. And we're looking at it as though it's in two acts. Act 1 was chapters 4 through 11. And that began with a scroll that was in the hand of God as he was sitting on the throne in the throne room in chapter 4. And it's the scroll that had 7 seals, and Christ broke each of those seals, and it opened, and that we saw every seal that opened, we saw a little bit more of the story, a little bit more of the picture. And we just saw Sunday morning in our class another scroll that was in the hand of an angel, and God told John, who's writing the Revelation, he said, take the scroll and eat it. It's going to be bitter in your stomach, but it's going to be sweet in your mouth. In other words, there's going to be some things in it that you're not going to like. There's going to be some things in it that you are going to like. There's going to be some good things and some bad things. And so Act 2 is now in that scroll. As that scroll is open, that's what we find the second part of this story. Our overall context of Revelation goes back to, and this is what we nailed down in our very first lesson, was the different views and ways that we approach the book of Revelation is approached by a lot of different people. And when we compare what Revelation says about itself, that the view of the Roman Empire and the persecution of Christians in that first century and what's going on at that time, it fits perfectly what we see in the book. And like I said, if you weren't able to be here for that lesson, go back and see that. How we want to let Revelation define itself. So that's why we are where we are. So Act 2, Sunday morning we started. As the curtain opens on Act 2, we're in Acts chapter 12, and we began this story Sunday morning where this woman appears. She's standing on the moon. She's as bright as the sun. And there's just an amazing picture of this woman. Also, we see the dragon, a big red dragon. When you see the big red dragon, you automatically know in the book of Revelation, it is who? It is Satan. We know that because Revelation 12 and verse 9 tells us it is Satan. Revelation chapter 20 also tells us the dragon is Satan. So we don't have to guess. Let the Bible define itself. What we started looking at is God is telling us in this story what Satan has been up to. And so we started looking at 4 attacks that Satan was making on this woman. And that's what was described. We already saw the first 2 and talked about the first 2. So the first one, this woman is with child, and she is about to give birth to a male child. And when this child is born, Satan is there waiting to attack. Well, the child that is born, we know, is representing Christ, the way that it describes this child there. And so we talked about all the different ways that Satan was trying to eliminate Christ while he was here on earth, from the day he was born to the day he died. And so that's the first attack. Well, he failed. He was not able to accomplish destroying Jesus while he was here on earth. So his second attack, and that's what's described in verse 7, beginning in verse 7, where it talks about Satan and his angels, then they pursue Christ into heaven. And Satan is trying to stop Christ from taking his seat by the throne of God. And so the timeline here Christ has died here on earth. He's been buried. He's been raised from the dead. He is ascended now to be with the Father in heaven. And that's what this picture is about. There's a war then in heaven. Satan and his angels meet up with Michael and his angels, and there's a war in heaven. We have no idea what war in heaven in the spiritual realm would look like. What all that involves, we just know the outcome. We know that Satan loses. He's cast down to the earth. And so, round 2, Satan loses. So, the third attack, and that's where we are tonight. The third attack, Satan is going to focus back on the woman who gave birth to the child. That's what it talks about beginning in verse 13 of chapter 12. It tells us that Satan chases her to harm her, but God gives her 2 wings like those of an eagle so she can fly to a place of safety. And it says it's for a time, and half a time. We've looked at, that's one of the numbers that we've looked at. It's the same period of time as 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days, those time periods that we see all throughout the book of Revelation. Well, 5 different times, but it's through the book of Revelation. And every time we see one of those numbers, it always represents what? Persecution, a time of persecution. We always see one of those numbers in a time when it's describing persecution on the church. And so God here, well, if we go back, we saw that God protected the temple for 42 months early in Revelation. He protected the 2 witnesses through a 1,260-day attack back a chapter or 2 ago. And now God protects this woman through a 3.5-year attack. The temple, those witnesses, this woman, they all represent the same thing. And we'll see that again as we go. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the different descriptions of time are all describing the same thing here. But Satan throws everything at this woman that he can in this third attack. And the way that it describes it is there in verses 15 and 16. It says that he poured out water like a river from his mouth to try to sweep her away. But then it tells us that the earth opened up and swallowed up the water to protect her. And so again, this is seen as the power of God and his ability to protect the woman. And so Satan loses round 3. And he is enraged. He is so frustrated that all of these attacks that he is making are failing. And so we see the 4th attack beginning in verse 17. Notice what it says in verse 17. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So the offspring, the children of this woman, are described as those who are keeping the commandments of God to hold to the testimony of Jesus. All right, that is a pretty good clue as to who the children of this woman are represented by here in this picture. So these are Christians who are obeying the commands of Christ. Those who are holding to the testimony of Jesus. There's only one group of people that have ever existed that describes. Those are Christians. That's the church. And so the children of this woman, that's who that's referring to. Now before we go any further, let's make sure that we know exactly who this woman is. The way that she's described here in chapter 12. The first thing, we know that she's greater than any one human being could ever be. She's standing on the moon. She's clothed with the sun. In some way, she's the mother of the Messiah. When the child is born, the description of the child is clearly the Messiah. So this woman is the mother of Christ. When she's attacked, God would not let her be destroyed. Christians are said to be her children. So who is this woman? Okay, Israel. Okay, Mary could be a part of that. Who else would we say this woman is? In the big picture, the woman is the way Revelation defines it. Let's call it just simply God's people. The woman represents the people of God. It represented the people of God in Israel because it was Israel ultimately that gave birth to the Messiah. Then, once the church was established, God's people now are the church. So the woman continues to represent the same thing. It's God's people of all time. She's representing Israel, God's chosen people. She's representing the church, God's chosen people. And so that's the picture of this woman here in Revelation. And so we are left in the context of Satan's attack on the church. This fourth attack of what Satan is doing with the church. And so, And so, in that third attack, when Satan was thrown out of heaven, it says he came back and he went after the woman. The woman is God's people. The woman was the church at that time. And so that's the picture we see in the book of Revelation. The Roman Empire, the persecution that was taking place with the church at that time, and what they were doing, they were persecuting the woman, the church as a whole. But then God ultimately is going to protect the church. He's not going to let Satan destroy the church. He's going to fail at attack number 3. Attack number 4, he's going to go after her children. That's what we're living with today. Now Satan knows, okay, I failed to get rid of Christ when he was here. I failed to stop him from sitting on the throne. I failed to stop the church as a whole. I can see that's never going to work. But I can go after each and every one of them individually. Because if I can get one of them, if I can throw temptations and things in front of one of them, then I've at least won something away from Christ. And so that's why God is revealing to us here in Revelation 12 why Satan is still described as that lion that is prowling around seeking whom he may devour. Because he is so mad that he could not stop Jesus. And so he's taking it out on you and me. He wants us bad. And so that's the picture that God gives us of really the story, the eternal plan that's taking place and how Satan is involved in all of that. So the question is, how is Satan going to mount this vicious attack? We're going to back up to that third attack, that vicious attack on the church, on the woman. How is he going to do that? Because that's what the book of Revelation is. That's the center of the whole message. And so how is he going to do that? Well, Satan decides to bring up a powerful influence to do his bidding. And it's pictured as a beast who comes up from the sea. It says he has 10 horns and 7 heads, a body like a leopard, a mouth like a lion, and feet like those of a bear. He blasphemes God. He exercises his authority for 42 months. That's in verse 5 of chapter 13. 42 months. We're obviously talking about what here? Persecution. That when that number shows up, we know that's what it's in context of. He makes war with the saints. There's the persecution. Authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. Most of the world worships this beast, except not everybody is worshiping this beast. Look at chapter 13 and verse 8. It says, all who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name that has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. So everyone's worshiping the beast except for those that belong to God, those whose names are written in the book of life. And so not everybody's worshiping the beast, but some are. If we went to chapter 17, we would also see this beast described. The 7 heads, it tells us in chapter 17, verses 9 and 10, represent 7 kings. It says that 5 of those kings are in the past, 1 of those kings still exists, and 1 of those kings is yet to come. In chapter 17 and verse 9, it also mentions that the 7 heads also represent 7 hills or 7 mountains. And so with all of those things, the way that those are all described, and we went over this in more detail in our very first lesson. This is one of our 7 keys to unlocking the book of Revelation. Who does this beast, by the picture that the book of Revelation paints, who does this beast represent? It's Rome. And there's so many things that we fit. The 7 hills gives it away, because anyone who has studied their history and geography knows of only one place in the world that is known as a city that is on 7 hills, and that's the city of Rome. And so it's and like I said, if you weren't here for that very first lesson, we go into a lot of detail in looking at all of these things and how we come to that conclusion. The only thing, or the question is, that why would, in the first century, early on, why would the Roman Empire have such a dislike for Christians? And that's a question that has to be asked. Because the Roman Empire, they allowed other groups of people to continue with their own religion. When they would go conquer a nation, they were fine with those nations that they conquered with letting them go ahead and worship the way they wanted to worship. We see the Jews, the Romans, while they had conquered Judea, they let the Jews continue to worship in the temple, worship God, and do it the way that they're supposed to. And the Rome didn't have an issue with that. So why pick on Christianity? Why was Christianity the one thing that the Roman Empire would not allow to take place, and all the persecution came on Christians? Well, that's what Satan is getting ready to do as he brings up the beast, the Roman Empire. He also brings up a second beast to ensure that the beast, the Roman Empire, has a reason to persecute Christians. Satan brings up the second beast, chapter 13, verses 11 through 17. The description is, he has 2 horns like a lamb. He comes up with the first beast here in chapter 13. What's interesting is that he also goes down with the first beast in chapter 19. He works under the authority of the first beast. That's in verse 12. It tells us that his sole purpose is to set up statues of the head of the first beast and require people to worship them. So, the second beast is setting up images of the heads of the first beast. If we're looking at the first beast as the Roman Empire, the heads of the Roman Empire are its emperors. It's amazing. History shows us that the Roman Empire set up images of their emperors for people to worship. And so it fits exactly what we're seeing here. And so the second beast, it tells us, is forcing people to worship the image of the first beast. And everyone who worshiped these images is going to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And so here's the second mark that we've seen in the book of Revelation. We go back to chapter 7, and God said, stop, wait, I want to mark my people. I want to put my mark on those that are faithful. And now we're seeing the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast, or his number 666, marked on them. There are so many different things that are talked about in the religious world about the mark of the beast and 666. But we can't go away from the way that we've looked at everything else in Revelation. We have to be consistent. Numbers have meaning. They're pictures. They're symbolic. We know the number 7 is a number for perfection. Sometimes it's referred to as the number of God because of its perfection. And so the number 6 is just short of perfection. It's incomplete. Or you could say it's a failure. The number 6 is what it represents. That's not just here in Revelation. If you study apocalyptic language, even outside of the Bible, you'll see the number 6 used in reference to things that are incomplete and things that have failed. And so it's not just, it's an apocalyptic way of looking at this number, not just what we find here in this book. And what they do, when they would take numbers and they would add them to each other, they multiply them with each other, all they're doing is emphasizing those numbers. We've already seen that in several places. So you have the number 6, that's failure. The number 66 would be total failure. The number 666 would be there is no greater failure than what that number represents. And that's the way they would use numbers like that in apocalyptic writing. So chapter 13, verse 17, only the ones who had the mark of the beast on them, it says, would be able to buy and sell goods. And so during this time in history, we go back in history, we can see huge temples that were erected and the citizens of the Roman Empire that were forced to go before the emperor's altar. And one of the things that they would be required to do is they would take a pinch of incense and they would place that pinch of incense on the altar before the emperor's image. And they would confess that Caesar was their God. The Roman Empire, there was a group of people in the Roman Empire that were they were making people do this. If you didn't, then it was death. So, even when you visit, say, even today, if you go to visit the city of Ephesus today, you'll see things like this. This is the temples of Vespasian and Titus and Domitian that are there. And they're right next to the marketplace, the busiest part of the city of Rome. And right next to it would have been the temples to these emperors at that time. Just down the street a little bit was the temple to the Emperor Trajan. And so we see all of this happening exactly the way that God is drawing this picture. We see all of this happening in real life. So those who refused to worship the emperors were guilty of treason, and they were put to death. And so this second beast fits the exact description of what we could call kind of that cult of emperor worship that was taking place back then. You had the beast that was the Roman Empire. Then you had a second beast that was there working alongside of it. And it was forcing people to worship the first beast. And that fits exactly what we see historically of what was taking place. So how did Christians respond to this in the first century? Well, those who were faithful to Jesus, they refused to have anything to do with emperor worship. And so because of that, they would be sentencing themselves to either severe hardship, imprisonment, or most likely death. And it's because they would not bear the mark of the emperors of Rome. And we know that they would do that, in that the emperors of Rome, if they would bow down, they would be given a mark. Sometimes it was a brand, sometimes it was some type of an image. And that's what it describes here in the text about how only those with the mark were able to buy and sell. If they went into the market, they would be able to show, I have shown my allegiance to the emperor, and they could show their mark. It may have been a coin that they were given or some kind of a token, but they would show their mark and prove that, see, I've given my allegiance to the emperor. I've bowed before the emperor, and so they could do business. A Christian would not have one of those. So that is a part of the persecution that Christians were dealing with as well. And so at this point, now the Roman Empire has a reason to persecute Christians. Because most other nations that Rome has taken over, they are worshiping their own gods, but they all believe in multiple gods. And so when the Rome comes to them and says, you're going to bow before Caesar because he is also a god, most other nations didn't have a problem with that. Okay, we'll worship Caesar too, along with all of our other gods. They didn't have any problem with that. But Christians did. Christians were one of the only ones who did. And so here the dragon, Satan, he knew that I can get Rome, the beast, to persecute the church because he knew that these Christians would not bow down to Satan. So Satan is the one that is implementing all of this so that Christians would be persecuted. But Christians who were strengthened by the message of John, that John wrote here in the book of Revelation, they would hold to their testimony of Jesus. They refused to worship emperors. So Satan has set up what Satan probably thinks to be the greatest dilemma that a Christian could ever be faced with. It's either bow down to Caesar and not be faithful to God, or be killed. Satan doesn't understand that losing your life as a Christian is actually victory and not loss. But to Satan it was. He thought he had the perfect dilemma set up. But that's not what happened. There were Christians that were killed by the thousands. Some historians say that within the 200-year period of Roman persecution of the church, that over 6 million Christians were martyred by Rome. And it was done in some of the most terrible ways. But that persecution, we see the persecution starting. It started back during the reign of Nero. He's the one who put the Apostle Paul to death. It's subsided for a while under the rule of Vespasian and Titus, but it returned even stronger than ever before under Domitian, and that was around 81 to 96 AD. And this was the strongest attack that had ever been mounted on Christians. But Satan still didn't get what he was after. Satan was still not successful. Others in the Roman Empire, they would hear Christians singing songs of praise to their God as they were being led to their death. They would hear them praising their God when they knew that their life was going to be taken from them because they were praising their God. And this inspired so many other people in the Roman Empire. They wanted to know, what is it about this God that they're worshiping? They'd be that devoted to him. And then when they heard the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ, they were also converted. And so they were just replacing the ones who had just been killed by multiples replacing one who has just been killed. And the church continued to grow. So when the persecution finally stopped in the 4th century, Christianity was stronger than when the persecution began. And even to the point that the emperor of Rome was converted to Christianity. That was Constantine in 313 AD. So, although chapter 13 records what was going on behind the scenes of that horrific time, notice what God does here, though, when he follows this up at the very beginning of chapter 14. Look at chapter 14 and verse 1. John says, "Then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads." And so here are those that have been marked by the mark of God. We just saw those that have been marked by the mark of Satan. Remember how we looked at that? It's like an old cowboy western. Good guys wear the white hats, bad guys wear the black hats. That's how in the book of Revelation we know who the good guys are and the bad guys are. Who's marked by God, who's marked by Satan. And so that's what God uses to help to distinguish between the two, so we know who we're talking about. But what we see here, what was just said in chapter 14, verse 1, we're to a point in the story that the persecution is now over. John sees the Lamb. We know that Lamb, we've already seen it, him in the Revelation, that's Jesus, and he's standing on Mount Zion. With Jesus are the 144,000 who have the name of God written on their forehead. We originally saw them in chapter 7. We saw who they were back then, representing it's all of God's people. That number, 144,000. The 12 times 12, the two very religious numbers of the apostles and the tribes of Israel, and multiplied by 1,000, emphasizing just the enormity. Everybody that belongs to God is involved in this number. And so now they are in heaven with Jesus and have been rescued from the earth. Chapter 14 and verse 3, It says, and they began to sing a new song. And it was a song that only those who have died faithful to Christ were able to sing. But then John sees an angel appear. This angel cries out with a loud voice that God's judgment has come. And then another angel appears, shouting, "Fallen, fallen." This is in verse 8. "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality." Then a third angel appears, verses 9 through 11, and calls out to those who have worshiped the beast, those who have received the mark of the beast, that they will drink the wine of God's fury by suffering eternal punishment. Chapter 14 and verse 13, we see that John then hears another voice. It says, "Blessed are the dead who died in the Lord, that they may rest from their labors." There's the rest. The period of 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years, time and half a time, whichever way it's shown, that time of persecution is now over. We're to that place in the story, in the drama. The fall of the persecutor, Rome, is pictured in verses 14 through 20. The enemies of Christ are being cut down like grapes. They're being put into the winepress of God's wrath, and they're being squeezed out. And there's going to be more detail about Rome's defeat coming in the next couple of chapters. But it's being announced right here. It's building the anticipation of what's coming right here. Rome is about to be destroyed. And so we're given just a little bit of a glimpse as to what's coming here in the future. We're going to stop there. We're going to go back into a scene of heaven in chapter 15. And it tells us in verse 1, it says, "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels who had 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished." God just announced, those who are my enemies, those who bear the mark of Satan, you are now done. These bowls of wrath, they're going to be just like the 7 seals. Whenever each of the 7 seals was opened of that scroll, another part of the story was told. It's going to be just like the 7 trumpets. When each of the 7 trumpets was blown, another part of the story was told. Now, when each of the 7 bowls of wrath are poured out, another part of the story is going to be told. And so we see the same thing repeating 3 times through the Revelation. It just gets bigger and more significant as we go through. And so now it's describing the total judgment of God. And so in chapter 15, we'll start looking at that. We'll look at that on Sunday morning.